before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of it. The downtown office building stood like a glass monument to corporate success, its polished floors reflecting the ambitions of everyone who walked through its doors. On the 15th floor, behind mahogany desks and leather chairs, executives made decisions that shaped careers and lives. But today, something different was about to unfold in conference room. Be that Sarah Mitchell, the Human Resources Director, glanced at her watch as she reviewed the morning's interview schedule. 10 candidates for the Senior Logistics Coordinator position. Each one carefully screened, their resumes polished to perfection, their references checked twice. She prided herself on running a tight ship, on hiring only the best. The first 9 interviews had gone exactly as expected. Sharp suits, firm handshakes, rehearsed answers about strengths and weaknesses, professional smiles that never quite reached their eyes. Standard corporate theater, played out 1,000 times in offices across the country. But the 10th interview, that was different. At 11:47 a.m., Sarah's assistant Jennifer knocked on her door, her expression troubled. "Ms. Mitchell, there's a situation with the next candidate." Sarah looked up from her notes. "What kind of situation?" Jennifer glanced toward the lobby, then back at Sarah. "Well, he's here, but..." She paused, searching for the right words. "He doesn't exactly look like the others." Through the glass walls of her office, Sarah could see into the reception area. Sitting in the corner chair was a man who looked like he'd been sleeping rough for weeks. His clothes were clean but wrinkled, clearly obtained from a donation center. His hair was long and unkempt, his beard scraggly. Most telling of all, he clutched a torn duffel bag like it contained everything he owned, which it probably did. Sarah's first instinct was to cancel the interview. This was obviously some kind of mistake. Perhaps someone from the homeless shelter had gotten confused about a job placement program. But then she remembered the resume that had crossed her desk 3 days ago. Michael Torres, 22 years of military service, extensive logistics experience, recommendations from commanding officers that read like letters of commendation. On paper, he was perfect for the position. She just hadn't expected him to look like this. "Should I reschedule?" Jennifer asked, her voice carrying a mix of concern and barely concealed disgust. Sarah studied the man through the glass. He sat perfectly still, his posture straight despite his appearance. There was something about the way he held himself that seemed familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. "No," she said finally. "Send him in." Jennifer's eyebrows rose. "Are you sure? I mean, we have a corporate image to maintain. What if other employees see him? What if clients send him in?" Sarah repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. 5 minutes later, Michael Torres stood in the doorway of conference room B. Up close, his situation was even more apparent. His jacket was torn at the elbow. His shoes had seen better days, and there was a faint smell of the streets clinging to him despite obvious efforts to clean up. But his eyes were clear and alert. They swept the room once, taking in every detail, before focusing on Sarah with an intensity that made her sit up straighter. "Mr. Torres," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Please have a seat." He moved with surprising grace, settling into the chair without the nervous fidgeting she'd come to expect from candidates. His hands rested calmly on the table, and despite his appearance, there was a dignity about him that was unmistakable. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I know I don't look like your typical candidate." Sarah shuffled through her papers, buying time while she figured out how to handle this unprecedented situation. "Well, Mr. Torres, I have to say, your resume is impressive. 22 years in the Army, extensive logistics experience, multiple commendations, yes, ma'am. But I have to ask, your current employment situation?" Michael's jaw tightened slightly. "I've been between positions for the past 8 months. The transition to civilian life has been challenging." It was a diplomatic way of saying he'd been living on the streets. Sarah could read between the lines. She'd heard the stories about veterans struggling to find their place in the civilian world, but she'd never encountered it firsthand.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thumbs up. You can help more people hear this story by liking this video. Bell. Every week we share unforgettable stories of silent heroes.
I see. And what makes you think you're qualified for this position? For the next 20 minutes, Michael answered every question with precision and depth. He spoke about supply chain management, inventory control, and logistics coordination with the expertise of someone who'd managed operations in some of the world's most challenging environments. His knowledge was encyclopedic, his insights sharp, but Sarah found herself distracted by his appearance. How could she possibly present him to upper management? What would clients think? The company had a reputation to maintain as the interview progressed. She began asking increasingly difficult questions, hoping to find a flaw in his qualifications that would justify what she was already planning to do. "Mr. Torres," she said finally, "you clearly have the technical skills we're looking for, but this position requires someone who can represent the company to high-level clients, someone who can fit in with our corporate culture." Michael's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I understand. I'm not sure you do. This is a client-facing role. Appearance matters. First impressions matter. Surely you can understand our position." He nodded slowly. "Of course. Professional standards are important." Sarah felt a pang of guilt, but she pushed it aside. She had a job to do, a company to protect. "I appreciate you coming in today, Mr. Torres. We'll be in touch." It was a dismissal, polite but final. They both knew he wouldn't be getting the job. Michael stood, gathering his worn duffel bag. "Thank you for your time." As he turned to leave, Sarah was already reaching for her phone to call security. Not because she felt threatened, but because she wanted to ensure he was escorted out quietly, without other employees seeing him. But as Michael adjusted his bag, something went wrong with the zipper. It caught, then suddenly gave way, and several items scattered across the conference room floor: a worn paperback book, a small notebook, a water bottle, and something else, something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. IT was a metal, but not just any metal. Even from across the room, she recognized a distinctive star-shaped design, the light blue ribbon, the eagle in the center, the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, given only to those who distinguish themselves through acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. In the entire history of the United States, fewer than 3,500 had ever been awarded, and one of them was lying on her conference room floor, having fallen from the torn duffel bag of a man she just dismissed because of his appearance. Sarah's hand froze halfway to her phone. The security call she'd been about to make suddenly seemed not just inappropriate, but obscene. Michael quickly knelt to gather his belongings, his movements careful and respectful as he picked up the medal. But not before Sarah saw the inscription on the back, though she couldn't read the details from her position. "Mr. Torres," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that—" He looked up at her, still kneeling, the medal cradled in his hands. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something there she hadn't noticed before. Not just dignity, but a weight that comes from having seen and done things that most people could never imagine. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "It is—" Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. She'd been about to call security on a Medal of Honor recipient, a man who had served his country with such distinction that he'd been recognized with the highest honor America could bestow. I don't understand," she managed. "If you're a Medal of Honor recipient, how are you?" She couldn't finish the question. "How are you homeless? How are you unemployed? How are you sitting in my office looking like you've been sleeping in doorways?" Michael stood, having collected his belongings. He held the medal for a moment, looking at it with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he carefully placed it back in his bag. "The medal doesn't pay rent," he said simply. "And sometimes coming home from war is harder than the war itself." Sarah's mind raced. She'd heard statistics about veteran homelessness, but they'd been just numbers on a page, abstract concepts that didn't affect her daily life. But here was a living, breathing reminder that behind every statistic was a person who had served his country with honor and was now struggling to find his place in the world he'd fought to protect. "Mr. Torres, please sit back down." He paused at the door, then returned to his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "I was about to call security. I was going to have you escorted out because I was worried about how you'd look to our clients." Michael's face remained impassive. "I understand. Appearances matter in business." "No," Sarah said firmly. "No, they don't. Not like this. Not when it comes to judging a man's character or capabilities based on circumstances beyond his control." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere down there were dozens, maybe hundreds of other veterans struggling with the same transition Michael was facing. How many of them were being judged by their appearance rather than their service? "Tell me about the medal," she said, turning back to face him. "What did you do to earn it?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "With respect, ma'am, I'd rather not discuss the details. It was a long time ago, and it's not something I talk about often. I understand, but I need to understand how someone with your service record ends up in this situation." He studied her face, perhaps gauging her sincerity. Finally, he spoke. "I came back from my last deployment 3 years ago. 22 years of service, multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. I thought transitioning to civilian life would be straightforward. I had skills, experience, a track record of leadership." He paused, his hands clasped in front of him. "But it's not that simple. The skills that make you successful in the military don't always translate directly to civilian jobs. And when you spend 2 decades in a structured environment where your purpose is clear, where you're part of something bigger than yourself, the civilian world can feel empty." Sarah listened, beginning to understand. "I struggled with that transition. Started drinking to cope with the isolation, the sense that I didn't belong anywhere. Lost my apartment, then my savings. By the time I got sober and started looking for work seriously, I was already on the streets." "But surely there are programs." "There are," Michael interrupted gently, "and I've used many of them. VA services, job placement programs, transitional housing, but they can only do so much. At some point, you have to find an employer willing to look past the immediate circumstances and see the person underneath." Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat. "And I almost didn't do that." "Most don't," he said without bitterness. "I don't blame them. I know how I look. I know what assumptions people make. I just keep hoping that eventually someone will see past the surface." There was a knock at the door. Jennifer poked her head in, her expression concerned. "Ms. Mitchell, is everything all right? You've been in here for over an hour." Sarah realized she completely lost track of time. "Yes, Jennifer, everything's fine. Could you please cancel my next appointment?" "Cancel it? But you have?" "Cancel it," Sarah repeated. "And order lunch for 2, whatever Mr. Torres would like." Jennifer's confusion was evident, but she nodded and withdrew. "You don't have to do that," Michael said. "Yes, I do. I want to hear more about your experience, your military service, your logistics background, your thoughts on supply chain management. I want to conduct the interview you deserve from the beginning." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah learned more about leadership, logistics, and human resilience than she had in her entire career. Michael spoke about managing supply lines under fire, coordinating relief efforts in disaster zones, and leading teams through seemingly impossible challenges. But more than his technical skills, she was impressed by his character. Despite everything he'd been through, despite the way he'd been treated by potential employers, there was no anger or resentment in him, only a quiet determination to prove himself worthy of another chance. "Mr. Torres," she said as her conversation wound down, "I want to offer you the position, not because of your medal, not out of pity, but because you're genuinely the best candidate I've interviewed." His composure cracked slightly. Thank you, but I need to be honest with you. I don't have appropriate interview clothes. I don't have a permanent address. There are going to be challenges. We'll figure out," Sarah interrupted. "All of it. The company has resources, and more importantly, we have an obligation to support those who've served our country." Michael was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah thought she saw moisture in his eyes. "There's something else," he said finally. "Something I should tell you about the medal." Sarah waited. "I didn't earn it for myself. I earned it for my team. 3 good men died that day, and I was just the one who survived to tell their story. Every day since then, I've tried to live up to their memory, to make their sacrifice mean something. What do you think they would say if they could see you now? Michael smiled. The first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him. They'd probably tell me to stop feeling sorry for myself and get back to work. Then let's get you back to work. 3 months later, Michael Torres stood in the same conference room where his life had changed. But this time, he was on the other side of the table, conducting interviews for his own assistant. He wore a crisp suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his beard professionally groomed. The transformation was remarkable, but Sarah knew it went deeper than appearance. He'd found his purpose again. His place in the world of the company's logistics operations had improved dramatically under his leadership. Client satisfaction was up, costs were down, and efficiency had reached levels they'd never achieved before. But more than that, his presence had changed the entire culture of the department. He'd implemented programs to support other veterans transitioning to civilian careers. He'd established partnerships with local homeless shelters and job training programs. He'd become a mentor to younger employees, teaching them about leadership and service. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, finding her in the hallway after his interviews, "I wanted to thank you again for seeing past the surface, for giving me a chance when no one else would." Sarah smiled. "I didn't give you anything you didn't earn. You just needed someone to recognize what was already there. Still, it made all the difference." As he walked away, Sarah reflected on how much she'd learned from that encounter. She'd always prided herself on being a good judge of character, but she'd almost made a terrible mistake. She'd almost let prejudice and assumptions blind her to genuine worth. Now, whenever she interviewed candidates, she remembered the man with the torn jacket and the Medal of Honor. She remembered that true value isn't always visible on the surface, and that sometimes the best people are the ones who face the greatest challenges. The medal now sat in a place of honor in Michael's office, not as a display of ego, but as a reminder of the men who didn't make it home, of the responsibility that comes with survival, and of the importance of never giving up on yourself or others, because sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding behind the most ordinary appearances. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who've fallen the furthest and found the strength to rise again. And sometimes all it takes is someone willing to look past the surface to see the honor underneath. 6 months after that first interview, the company received a visit from a delegation of military officials. They were there to present Sarah with a Civilian Service Award for her work supporting veteran employment. As she accepted the award, she looked out the assembled crowd and saw Michael in the front row, standing at attention in his dress uniform. The same uniform he'd worn when he received his Medal of Honor all those years ago. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him were 3 other veterans who'd found employment through the programs he'd established. Each one had their own story, their own struggles, their own journey from the streets to success. The cycle continued. One act of compassion, one moment looking past the surface, had rippled outward in ways Sarah never could have imagined. Because that's what happens when we choose to see the person instead of the problems. When we choose to honor service instead of judging circumstances. When we choose to believe that everyone deserves a second chance, especially those who've given everything for their country. The security guard was never called that day, but what fell from that torn jacket changed everything. Not just for Michael Torres, but for everyone whose life he would touch in the years to come. Sometimes, the most important moments in our lives look like failures at first. Sometimes, the greatest opportunities come disguised as problems. And sometimes, the most valuable people are the ones everyone else overlooks. The question isn't whether heroes walk among us. The question is whether we have the wisdom to recognize them when they do. This story was brought to you by The Human Stories. Have you ever met someone who looked ordinary but turned out to be extraordinary? Tell us in the comments about a time when you discovered someone's hidden strength or service. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.